slide deck with you after the webinar itself. We will allocate dedicated time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. But if you wish to make these comments or questions as we go along, please do so in the chat. In particular, if you wish to ask a question, it will be useful to precede your question with a cue so that we can make sure that we address them at the end. We have a very short post-webinar survey, which we hope that you will complete for us at the end of the webinar itself. So to start, I'll give an overview of the webinar. I want to make an argument for change, for the need for change. And I also would like to give you an indication of the survey results that you completed prior to the webinar itself. We will then go into looking at diagnostic assessments as an approach to understanding student needs and developing student-centered solutions. I will do that for about 20 minutes. This will be followed by Sanet Steyn talking about the MBT itself as a diagnostic assessment, the national benchmark tests. And she will spend about 20 minutes on that. Following Sanet's presentation, we will have Tatiana Sango and Precious Mudavanhu talk about using a scenario, using the MBT diagnostic information to inform wraparound support. At the end, Sanet will come back and talk about an assessment-led approach to curriculum development, and she will spend about 10 minutes on that. And then we are allowing about 10 minutes for questions and answers, and I hope that that will be sufficient for the discussions that will be generated through the webinar itself. So the necessity for change. I want to make an argument for 4 aspects for the need for change. The first thing I argue is our South African participation is still largely low, about 20%. Secondly, I argue that the throughput rates are low within South African for 3-year degrees, for example, and I'll show some information in a minute. The third thing I'm arguing for is that dropout rates are high, comparatively speaking. And fourthly, I think that COVID has had a huge impact, and we will have to think differently if we look at next year and the next few years as we go along. So the first slide I've got is a slide that gives us an indication that South Africa's participation rate is about 20%. If you look at South Africa compared to the other countries with similar GDPs, then you can see that it isn't as good or as high as other countries. So there's a need for a concerted effort to increase the participation rates. The second thing is that if we look at our graduation rates or throughput rates within 3 years for a 3-year degree, you can see in this particular table that the rates are in the vicinity of 20% to in the early 30%, which is certainly nothing to be proud of. I think it is quite disconcerting how low those figures are nationally. The next thing is the question about this particular graph just gives it graphically that the graduation rates are in the vicinity of 20%, 20-odd%, 25, 26% in the first year, growing up to about 45% in the second year, and so on. So it does improve, but certainly the cost of that improvement over time is something to be worried about. The next one is the dropout rate table. So here we've got the table for dropout rates after 2 years for a 3-year degree. And you can see that we're talking about in the late teens, by the second year, people are dropping out. And if we look at year 3, it's in the vicinity of 20% 20-odd%, late 20s. So these are things that we have to worry about. So let's look at the COVID-19 situation. I make the point that, that we need to anticipate that the effect of the pandemic is going to mean that we're going to have to work differently in all sectors and disciplines in the country. But particularly in higher education, we may need to find additional interventions over the next few years as we come to grips with the effects that the COVID-19 pandemic period will have had on the academic performance of our students, both at school and at university. I'm arguing that changes in higher education must take into account the changes in the student needs. And I think the student needs are changing as we look over the next few years. The challenges facing higher education in a post-COVID-19 South Africa will be manifold and will stem from a number of diverse factors. It may be tempting to focus solely on issues such as the financial implications for institutions that are already suffering from insufficient funding and lack of resources. However, even before the pandemic struck, various authors alerted us to the growing need for more responsive curricula. Our responsiveness as institutions and educators to the needs of our students is perhaps now more important than ever before. It is crucial that we investigate approaches that will enable us to understand the new needs of our students. We did the survey and we asked essentially 6 questions. The first question was, the COVID-19 pandemic has created significant disruption to the school year. What do you think its impact will be on the grade 12 class of 2020 and their preparedness for higher education? Some of the concerns that you raised were that there will be gaps in content knowledge, competencies, not enough time spent on foundational components, etc. You also argued for that there will be a lack of practice, lack in confidence possibly in those areas, greater disparities between those with means and those without the means. Lack of resources would be a particular area of concern, and guidance during lockdown period and beyond. More support was felt will be needed in the higher education sector for the 2021 intake cohort. But, and this is quite encouraging, there may be some positive outcomes. There may be students coming into higher education with a greater independence, more ownership, possibly more responsible for their own learning, more confidence in their own abilities where they have been successful, and a more developed resilience and maybe an increased grit. The second question we asked was, how do you think this will or should affect teaching and learning for the 2021 class at your institution? Higher education, these were the things that were said, and I will just take sort of 5 points or 6 points that was mentioned. Higher education will need to be more attuned to what was covered in FET. Now, I think this is quite important in general, but I think we more so now we have to think about the FET curriculum. Secondly, institutions will need to provide more support to facilitate the transition from FET to higher education. Thirdly, existing student support will need to be augmented or strengthened. Fourthly, experience with online delivery in 2020 forced changes in higher education, in some cases improvements this year, and will be a solid foundation for further changes. So in some ways, we will be more prepared next year than we are prepared this year, or were prepared this year. This is an opportunity for reflection and evaluation of existing practices and potential revision of curricula for a new generation of students. The third question we asked is, have you ever designed diagnostic assessments? And the vast majority, some 63% of you suggested that you did not design diagnostic assessments previously, with only 36% saying that they, or 37% saying that they have designed diagnostic assessments. And I think if diagnostic assessments are a contributor to us understanding the challenges, then certainly this is an area that I think we need to develop collectively. The fourth question was, have you or your institution used diagnostic assessments before? And if so, for what purposes? And we made this into a yes/no question. And again, the majority said yes, about 75%, 3/4, and about 1/4 said no. Of the 3/4 that said yes, some of them said not for diagnostic purposes, so just just over 1/4 of the total. And I think this is, again, sort of pointing towards diagnostic assessment as an area. The fifth question we asked was, what is the one thing you would most like to learn more about during the workshop? And the points that were raised were how to develop and use diagnostic assessments, to get a sense of what existing diagnostic instruments like the MBT are saying about the student profile, understanding of the design principles involved in creating diagnostic assessments, and how measurement theory principles are applied, insight into the different use of diagnostic instruments, understanding of how different data sets like the MBT and the NSC can be combined to understand the needs of students. And lastly, diagnostic assessments as formative tools, as prediction of future success and for placement. The sixth question was, what are the expectations for this workshop? What do you hope to gain from it? And how will the learning be used in your institution to support student success? These expectations were very similar and aligned to the webinar itself. And so we were heartened by this particular comments. I'll just read out a few comments quickly. Introduction to the design principles and decisions involved in the development of diagnostic instruments, considerations in the use of diagnostic instruments and how this may relate to the current challenges higher education is facing, a concrete example of the use of existing instruments for diagnostic purposes, and some participants specifically mentioned the use of the MBT. There were comments about the use of these instruments for admission and for placement that will be mentioned in our presentation, but are not the specific focus of this webinar. I now want to talk about diagnostic assessments as an approach to understanding student needs and developing student-centered solutions. And Webb in 2006 described diagnostic tests as being designed to identify the learning problems students are having, or whether a student meets a certain level of educational attainment. The purpose of diagnostic assessment is to identify a student's strengths and weaknesses. And it's both of these things. It's not just looking at weaknesses, it's strengths and weaknesses for the purpose of admissions. And here we think about admission as being selection, but particularly placement in our particular context, and curriculum development. It can be used to inform changes in our approach to the content and skills related to the domain, the instrument measures, and this could be anything. I mean, the MBT assesses in certain areas, but it could be in physics or in chemistry or in psychology or anything like that, or accounting. But with diagnosis as our priority, it's important to keep two questions in mind. How do we elicit the type of information that will enable us to understand each student's strengths and weaknesses? And secondly, what do we do with that information once we have it? Current curricula predominantly cater to the needs of the average student and need to be redesigned and move away from this one-size-fits-all approach to take the needs and characteristics of the target group into account. I'm particularly going to want to talk about Vygotsky's zone of proximal development and look at a visualization of this, because I think it's useful for us to describe and understand the profile of our students and therefore their needs in relation to this. Visualizing the zone of proximal development can be seen as a student or a person on a trajectory. There are things in front of them that they can do on their own. There are things in the shaded area that they can do with some guidance. And there are things in the black area that they can't yet do, no matter how much guidance you give them. What we want to do is bring in diagnostic information to inform that arrow down to the things they can do with some guidance. So what kind of guidance do they need? Developing the diagnostic assessment is three things. It's art, it's craft, and it's science. I think it requires all three of those things to be able to do so. We think about the test cycle as a cycle, and I've got it here as a cycle here, and I'll just speak to each of these things as we go through them. Firstly, it's important to develop for a test, an assessment, any assessment, doesn't have to be a diagnostic assessment program, to establish clearly the test purpose. How will the test scores be used? Is the test intended for certification or for licensure? Will the emphasis of the test be on minimum competency or mastery of course disciplinary content? Overall, will the test be low stakes, moderate stakes, or high stakes for the examinees? That is, will the results of the test have important consequences for the examinees? The answers to these questions will have implications for many aspects of the test, such as the overall length of the test, the average difficulty of the items, the conditions under which the test will be administered, and the type of information to be provided on the score reports. If you take the time at the beginning to establish a clear, focused test purpose, your goals and priorities will be more effectively met. The second thing in the cycle is to conduct a job analysis. Now, a job analysis sounds like in a professional arena, but it can be a job in a higher education setting or testing arena or basic education. This is conducted in order to identify the knowledge, the skills, and abilities that a person in a particular field ought to have. Within a test development effort, a well-conducted job analysis helps provide for the validity of the test that is later developed. The job analysis contributes to test validity by ensuring that the critical aspects of the job become the domain of content that the test measures. Other highly similar activities that are sometimes used to help promote the validity of a test include task analysis, practice analysis, and role delineation studies. A typical job analysis occurs in two phases. In the first phase, a list of job-related tasks is generated and refined, while in the second phase, a validation of that list of tasks is conducted. After the overall content of the test has been established through a job analysis, the next step is developing is to create detailed test specifications. Test specifications usually include a test description component and a test blueprint component. The test description specifies aspects of the planned test, such as the test purpose, the target examinee population, the overall test length, and more. The test blueprint, sometimes also called the table of specifications, provides a listing of the major content areas and cognitive levels intended to be included on each test form. It also includes the number of items each test form should include within each of these content and cognitive areas. We then move on to the test. Once the test specifications are complete, we move on to the item writing phase of the test development project and begin. Typically, a panel of subject matter experts is assembled to write a set of test items. The panel is assigned to write items according to the content areas and cognitive levels specified in the test blueprint. Items are written for each of the item types identified in the test specifications. By far, the most commonly used item type in standardized assessment is the multiple choice item due to its relative advantages, including its ability to use to measure at higher cognitive levels. Some exam programs use item specifications to further guide item writers with detailed requirements for each included item type. The total number of items that a particular assessment program needs depends on specific aspects of the assessment program. After the items have been written, they are stored electronically in an item banking software application. Once this is done, an important next step in the test development process is to review the items. The items need to be reviewed for several different types of potential problems. Thus, it is often helpful to have different types of experts conduct specific reviews Subject matter experts should review the items to confirm that they are accurate, clearly stated, and correctly keyed. Professional editors can then review the items for grammar, punctuation, and spelling. Measurement experts can review the items to be sure that they are not technically flawed, and the items can also be reviewed for fairness to ensure that they will not be likely to disadvantage any examinee subgroups. The items may also be reviewed to ensure that they match the test specifications and are written at an appropriate readability level. The review process is valuable for identifying problems which should then be corrected before the items are field tested. After a set of drafted items have been reviewed by test development and subject matter staff, the items should be ready for field testing on examinees. When items are field tested, they are not scored and they are not used to measure examinees. Instead, the items themselves are evaluated. An item field test is conducted to collect information about how well the items are likely to function operationally before they are actually used to contribute to an examinee score. For that information to be accurate, it's important that a field test includes appropriate examinees. The field test examinee should be representative of the test population. That is, they should be as similar to future test takers as possible. The examinee should also be motivated. That is, they should be attempting to do so, to take the test as well as possible when they respond to the items. Items may be evaluated at different test development phases under pilot tests, field tests, and pre-test conditions. In all these instances, data are collected to ensure the high quality of the items and tests. That information is then used to conduct an item analysis and review of the items prior to allowing items to be included on operational test forms. After draft items have been reviewed and field tested, and item analysis statistics have been obtained on the items, operational test forms can be assembled. Each new test form for the assessment program ought to be assembled to satisfy all of the elements in the test specifications, and particularly in the test blueprint process, helps ensure that each resulting test form satisfies the intended purposes of the test. Most assessment programs follow the process to develop not just a single test form, but multiple forms. These multiple test forms should be assembled so that they are similar to one another as possible, or parallel. The use of multiple parallel test forms provides improved test security for the assessment program. After test administration, statistical equating of the parallel forms often needed. Standard setting is the process used to select a passing score for an exam. Of all the steps in the test development process, the standard setting phase may be the one most like art rather than science. While statistical methods are often used in the process, it is greatly impacted by judgment and policy. The passing score, also known as the passing point, the cutoff score, or the cut score, is used to classify examinees as either masters or non-masters. An examinee's score must be equal to or greater than the passing score in order for that examinee to be classified as a master or to pass the test. If an examinee is misclassified, that is referred to as a classification error. Typically, the judges set the passing score at a score point on the exam that reflects the minimum level of competency to protect the public from harm or to provide minimal competency at the occupational level being assessed. For the standard setting to be conducted successfully, the panel of judges should be carefully selected and then thoroughly prepared and trained for their task. There are a number of approaches to standard setting, including informed judgment, conjectural, and contrasting groups methods. Item analysis is an important phase in the development of an assessment program. In this phase, statistical methods are used to identify and any test items that are not working well. If an item is too easy, too difficult, failing to show a difference between skilled and unskilled examinees, or even scored incorrectly, an item analysis will reveal it. The two most common statistics reported in an item analysis are the item difficulty, which is a measure of the proportion of examinees who responded to an item correctly, and the item discrimination, which is a measure of how well the item discriminates between examinees who are knowledgeable in the content area and those who are not. An additional analysis that's often reported is the distractor analysis. The distractor analysis provides a measure of how well each of the incorrect options contributes to the quality of a multiple choice item. Once the item analysis information is available, an item review is conducted. Test administration procedures are developed for an assessment program in order to help reduce measurement error and to increase the likelihood of fair, valid, and reliable assessments. Specifically, appropriate standardized procedures improve measurement by increasing consistency and test security. Consistent, standardized administration of the test allows you to make direct comparisons between examinees' scores. Despite the fact that examinees may have taken their tests on different dates at different sites and with different proctors. Furthermore, administration procedures that protect the security of the test help to maintain the meaning and integrity of the score scale for all examinees. Lastly, once the test has been administered and the results collected, examinees' responses can be scored. Examinee answer sheets are typically first scanned and then an item analysis is conducted. If the item analysis reveals any problems, the problematic items may be rekeyed or dropped from the operational use. If these corrections are needed, the answer sheets are then rescored. Once scoring is complete, the passing score that was set for the exam is then applied. Next, it may be useful to compute the proportion of examinees who were classified as masters and non-masters, or to plot a frequency distribution of all examinees' total test scores. Finally, score reports for the individual examinees are prepared. Each examinee's raw score, that is the number of proportion of items that have the examinee responded to correctly, is often converted to one or more other types of scores. Various types of scores that an assessment program might choose to provide on the examinee's score reports include the pass-fail decision, diagnostic information, the examinee's percentile rank, and the examinee's scale score. Consequence for the students: what do the institutions or organizations do with the results? How are they interpreted? Judgments and decisions must not only link back to the purpose of the instrument identified at the outset, but also must be informed by the findings of the standard setting exercise. To ensure transparency and fairness, these facts must be clear to all candidates before they complete the test. With a diagnostic instrument, for example, the candidates must be made aware of some of the possible outcomes. We now move on to the MBT as a diagnostic assessment, and I hand over to Sanet Steyn.
Robert. So if we look back at the visualization of the zone of proximal development, what we were saying is that diagnostic information can help us to determine what the abilities are of an individual, but for our purposes, we tend to find looking at it at cohort level to be more useful for teaching and learning purposes. So we can also sort of project that up to how we categorize what a cohort can do, more or less with some guidance, and more precisely what type of guidance we would want to provide for them. So what we're trying to argue here is that a diagnostic instrument can provide us with this type of information and tell us what we need to do in order to provide that guidance. And we're going to use the MBT as an example of a diagnostic instrument that can be used for this purpose. So speaking of purpose, the first thing then, if we look back at that test design cycle, is the purpose. So here, there are two crucial parts of the test design cycle that inform all of the other steps in the development of the instrument and in its eventual implementation. And by extension, users of the tests need to understand this in order to utilize the test and the test scores appropriately. So first is the purpose of the test, and in the case of the MBTs, the tests were designed to provide an indication of a student's readiness to enter higher education, and 4 uses of the test scores were identified from the outset. They were first to inform admissions, and these were particularly for the highly sought after programs such as medicine and engineering. Secondly, for making appropriate placement decisions, so deciding who needs to go into extended or augmented programs. And then the third and fourth uses are more clearly linked to more detailed diagnostic information. The first being that it can assist in developing curricula appropriate to not only the disciplinary demands, but also to the needs of students. And lastly, it provides the institution or educators with an understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of these students. So for the MBTs, we can look at the second part, which is the domain and the detailed specifications, which also pull through to all of the other parts of the test design cycle. In this case, it's important to note that for each domain, we have an overarching definition, which is then fleshed out with definitions for subdomains that form part of each of these domains. And this is then used to create the test specifications that we use when we design our papers. So in essence, when we look at what you as a user of a diagnostic instrument need to know, or as potentially someone who will be designing diagnostic instruments, is that the first two questions, why you are assessing and how you will be assessing, are very important and need to be reflected in each of the steps along the cycle. So whether we are developing the items based on the blueprint or reviewing those items further down the line, if we're trying to determine cut scores, or if we're talking about the interpretation of the results, we all need to go back to what the answers are to those two questions, why and how. So if you understand that, you'll probably mostly focus on the recommendations that are given for under the scoring and interpreting section. But what we would want to emphasize here is that in order to really understand what is meant by these recommendations, you also need to know where they are coming from and how they informed the design process. If you know that, then it helps you to understand what the diagnostic information means. In other words, what it is saying about the profile of the candidates, and that in turn helps to inform the design decisions for the development of curriculum interventions, augmented curricula, or even recurriculation. So let's look at what we know about the scoring, reporting, and interpreting of the MBTs so that we can understand what the decisions are or what our options are based on those. There are 3 performance bands and they are the basic, intermediate, and proficient. And for our reporting purposes, we usually split intermediate and into intermediate upper and intermediate lower. Now, these cut scores are determined through a standard setting process every 3 years, and we include experts from across the country from different institutions in our panels, and we train them in this very rigorous process of doing the standard setting. And then these categories then play a really important role in how we report on the results. So to simplify this, we could say that the students who fall in the basic usually would need extensive support. Those who fall in the intermediate lower typically go into extended programs. Intermediate upper would still need quite a lot of support, but they can often get away with additional workshops or augmented courses. And finally, even those in the proficient section would need some sort of guidance. And in some cases, you will see that when we look at the more detailed view of performance in the domain, certain subdomains are tricky for students regardless of in which one of these performance bands they fall. So we report on 4 levels for the MBTs, and we'll quickly give you a brief overview of what they are and what you can do with that information. So the first one is the student feedback reports that we are piloting at the moment, and that gives you an individual's performance in terms of the subdomains in addition to the domain, which is something new. The cohort level analysis is perhaps the more important one for our teaching and learning goals, and we'll talk a little bit about that more, but this is particularly at course or at program level. Then we have the institutional level reports that look at an institution-wide view, and that, in addition to giving us the performance breakdowns, also provide faculty comparisons. And finally, we have the national reports that do a lot of the same things, but in addition to that, also gives us comparisons about what's happening in the sector, and also comparisons to things like the NSC results. So the first one is the individual student feedback report. This provides us feedback on an individual's strengths and weaknesses in particular subdomains. This is ideal for things like one-on-one mentoring, or where you want to use that type of information in a formative way. So this would typically require that sort of setting. Otherwise, the more useful thing to look at would be a cohort level analysis, where you look at the needs of a group of students. Here, as we said earlier, this would typically be for a course or perhaps a program. And here we have sort of 3 steps that we go through. Firstly, we try to understand what the results look like for that cohort. So we look at their performance overall across the domains, as well as their subdomain performance. Then we take that a little bit further if we have the right information, and we do a post-course analysis, which compares performance on the course itself to the performance in the various subdomains, to try and understand how performance on that diagnostic instrument might relate to performance in the course. And finally, we do a domain mapping exercise, which basically puts the results that we've dealt with in the previous 2 parts into conversation with the curriculum itself. Then we have our institutional reports. As I said earlier, this is at faculty level or at institution level. Here, the additional affordance we have is that it can compare, it allows us to compare the needs of different faculties. So where you have different support structures or different policies for different faculties, this is most likely a very useful part in making those decisions. And then finally, we have the national cohort. Here we get feedback on the cohort's performance and a sort of view of the sector-wide performance on these various parts of the domain. And this could potentially be how we notice systemic issues that we need to take action on. Another advantage of this level of reporting is that we compare it to the National Senior Certificate data, so that we can see how those 2 complement each other and what they say about each other. So there are 3 steps then for going into the designing of curriculum intervention that sort of informed by these assessments. And I'm going to hand over to Tatiana, who will be dealing mostly with a scenario that will help us with understanding the student profile, which is step 1. And when she's done, we'll get back to the other 2. So.
Okay, so we look at the, sorry, there is echo. All right, so we look at the scenario where course performance has been analyzed and put against the student profile, and in order to try to understand who the students are and what their background is, and vice versa, what the needs of the student profile tell us about the course itself. The same course for different students. So the CTAP team had been tasked in helping to analyze performance of a group of students in a specific course. Let's say this is a first semester half course for a cohort of first year students. The task is to understand that performance in the first year students, and the aim is to assist the department in finding a strategy of reversing the poor performance trend by using MBT diagnostic information in order to evaluate students' preparedness for the course itself. The data that was made available and used for the study was MBT mathematics, academic and quantitative literacy results, NSC mathematics and physics results, as well as the course itself, test 1, test 2, and final examination results. The approach has been taken to use the results for the whole course cohort and separately individual department students only. Then to run the MBT mathematics, academic and quantitative literacy subdomain analysis, and to compare profiles of students in different programs. When that is done, to perform MBT relative importance analysis in relation to performance in different assessment tasks within the course itself. The results indicated then that there are differences in students' profiles, and as the result, the support programs would need to take this into account when it comes to different intervention designs or the course itself scope. Looking at the information that was shared by the faculty itself, we can see that over the past 6 years, the results are getting worse. And in particular, this course is becoming gradually a course impeding graduation. The average course performance is within 50% in 2019, hitting exactly 15%. Further, looking at different departments, for the same course takers, we can we analyzed different departments. We looked at 4 different departments within the same faculty. Our case study or the scenario here is around the green department or department 1. What we can see overall is that performance is getting worse across different departments, and looking at the breakdown of results by departments for the past 6 years, we can see that students from department 1 are consistently scoring below 55%. In 2019, they're hitting the mark of 47%. And even other department students' scores are also decreasing. The first step in the analysis is to shape the MBT student profile for the course takers. The first one we're looking at here on your screens is mathematics. On the left-hand side, there is a graph showing the whole cohort performance in MBT mathematics, and on the right-hand side, it compares the performances of our interest group, or that green department 1, with the rest of the cohort. Starting with mathematics, what we can see is that the highest proportion of candidates scored within the proficient band in MBT mathematics test at 62.9%. This is the graph on the left-hand side in proficient category. Candidates scored in the basics 1.1 and intermediate lower 9.6% bands. However, comparing our interest group on the right-hand side with the rest of the cohort pool of students, we can see no basic students in interest group, more than double the proportion of students in intermediate lowers, 16.7 compared to 7.6 in the rest of the cohort. Larger proportion intermediate upper students, 29.5 compared to 26.4, and lower proportion of proficient students. So the profiles already starting to differ. The next subject to look at and next performance indicator is MBT student profile in academic literacy. Now, the academic literacy profile, looking at the figure on the left, we can see that the majority of the candidates in this group at 64% scored within the proficient band. 17.4% scored within the basic or intermediate lower bands and would need, therefore, extensive support in the competencies related to this domain. 18.5 in the intermediate upper category would need some support relating to the AL domain. The chart on the right-hand side of this figure provides the academic literacy proficiency for the interest group, the green department, compared to the rest of the cohort registered for this course. The interest group has 55% with scores in proficient category compared to 67%, further indicating that we do have, in fact, different groups of students. Now, moving on to MBT profile in quantitative literacy. QL profile on the whole cohort on the left-hand side shows that the group performance is just more than half of the cohort. 53% has scores in the proficient band. However, just under half would need support in quantitative literacy subdomains. The chart on the right shows the differences again between the department, which is the interest group, the green group, 41% with scores in proficient compared to the rest of the cohort, 56%. This suggests that just under 60% of interest group students would need support and competencies relating to QL. So having looked at the three domains of the NBT test, we can see that the student profiles differ. Further, we looked at NSC student profile. We looked at 4 different subjects: English, first additional language, home language, physical sciences, and mathematics. What we can see from this figure is that students from the interest group who were accepted into this program exhibit strong academic performance profile in the NSC examination mostly in all 4 subjects. Perhaps the lowest one in the first additional language, which is above 75% and higher than the whole cohort results. Next step is to look at subdomain analysis, and we again examine the 3 subjects of interest: mathematics, quantitative literacy, and academic literacy. Looking at the mathematics on the left-hand side, again, you're seeing the whole cohort group, and on the right-hand side, you have the interest group performance in mathematics. The math subdomain scores of the whole group of students in the first. Why am I muted? Okay. Show that algebraic processing, their median is 10% lower than the group median, still at 70%, however, and algebraic processing itself includes students' ability to perform different algebraic manipulations, work with numerical patterns, solve financial problems, and use different formulas. And then we're looking at geometric reasoning. Median is 5% lower than the group median at 65%. And geometric reasoning itself involves solving analytic geometry problems, linking geometric and algebraic properties, use properties of circle, geometry, etc. So the whole group might also show some weaknesses in number sense and geometric reasoning. The profiles are not that different, but there are notable differences which might impact performance of these students from our interest group in the course, specifically the one that is under investigation here. Now let's look at quantitative literacy. Areas of possible concern for the interest group students: shape, dimension, and space, change and rates, 8% lower median, 54%, slightly weaker in data representation and analysis, 67 compared to 70, slightly weaker in quantity, number, and operations, 68 compared to 17, relationships, pattern, and permutation, smaller spread, lower median, shape, dimension, and space, median 52 compared to 60%. Again, we are seeing some differences. And then finally, looking at academic literacy, whole cohort compared to interest group. Given that we have seen that the high proportion of students that scored within the proficient band in AL, it wasn't really surprising that overall the academic literacy subdomain scores were quite high, with a possible exception of text genre and vocabulary. Less than 25% of the cohort scored below 65% in these subdomains. Performance in those 2 subdomains suggests that additional support might be needed for the students. For the interest group students, the two subdomains with the lowest median were communicative function and text genre. There is, however, a high proportion of students in the interest group that scored below 40% in discourse relations. More than 25% scored below 40%, while the only 25% of their peers scored below 50% and even less below 40%. So this is showing you a little more depth in the MBT profile of the students, and again highlights the differences between the whole cohort of students taking the specific subject and compared to their performances in specific department, or the green department in our case. All right, next analysis that could be done is the relative importance analysis. It is quite an interesting one because we are looking at the relative importance of different subdomains within the MBT domains and their importance in performance of the students in a course, and explaining variance in the course performance. So this figure shows the relative importance analysis for performance of the course cohort in each of the three domains in terms of 5 performance bands. 4 of the mathematics subdomains show strongest relative importance. They are right at the bottom, and they are geometric reasoning, trigonometric functions and graphs, algebraic processing, and functions and graphs, followed by academic literacy subdomains, metaphorical expressions. It appears, for instance, that there is a strong relationship between performance on the MBT subdomains that dealt with non-literal language use and overall performance in this course. Analyzing the data further, we can look at the we can run relative importance of MBT subdomains in explaining variance in the course within the performance bands. So you have 4 different groups of students grouped by their performance. The top one shows you 0 to 30% performance in the exam. Then you have 40 to 49, 50 to 59, and 60 to 74% examination results. The last one is not available because there were only few observations. Even by just comparing the colors in each diagram, you can see that the profiles differ. And what it says that the different subdomains, different MBT subdomains, show higher or lower relative importance to the course performance in different performance bands. So what we have in 0 to 39% band is that QL, shape, dimension, space, and academic literacy, metaphor, and grammar show the strongest relative importance. In 40 to 49, again, AL, metaphor, and cohesion, and QL, quantity, number, and operations show stronger relative importance. Moving to 50 to 59, QL subdomains and AL subdomains play or show a higher relative importance, while interestingly enough, for the 60 to 74% band, mathematics subdomains show stronger relative importance, followed by QL and AL subdomains. Now, the next investigation that could be done is to look at the relative importance in different assessment tasks within the course. So what you see is the course test 1 that has been taken by the students few weeks into the course. And when we perform the relative importance of MBT subdomains in trying to explain the variance in test 1, the strongest subdomains are the mathematics subdomains. And then obviously this could be surprising, or it could raise some of the questions, and then you need to look at the course content. And the majority of the content covered prior to test 1 relies heavily on the prior knowledge in mathematics. So then it isn't surprising to see a graph of that nature. For example, some of the concepts are dealt with in CAPS FET physics grade 10 to 12, but not covered in CAPS mathematics, but will also rely on strong grounding in one of the subdomains subdomains that is coming up here, geometric reasoning subdomain. And all test one concepts rely on algebraic processes and strong number sense, graph sketching is required, and so on. So again, it indicates certain level of prior knowledge and concept grounding that is needed for the students to succeed in test one. Looking at the test one performance, comparing our interest group and the rest of the cohort, what we can say is that there are certain differences where one of the AL subdomains, cohesion, shows the strong relative importance in addition to mathematics subdomains, which you can see on the right-hand side. And it could signal that some of the students might have a problem with noticing links and signals within a text that they engage in their first year course. And that may impact on their ability to complete exercises in the course curriculum and specifically in relation to test one. So further looking at the course test, second course test that is further down the line, the mathematics subdomains still show the strongest relative importance for test two. However, now we can see a mix of other subdomains come into play, and that is the quantitative literacy, data representations and analysis, which here features quite strongly. Test two concepts focus on course specific applications. So once again, one could look at the curriculum and course load and try to analyze and make links to the profile of the students that we have. And comparing the two profiles, now here we can see real differences between the whole cohort with the rest of the cohort compared to our interest group from the department one, where what we see is that the differences in the interest group, performance in terms of literacies, academic literacies and quantitative literacies shows more importance or stronger relationship on overall performance on test two compared to test one. What could help further investigating these differences is the main mapping exercise to shed some light on the nature of the relevance of these domains to performance in test two. And finally, looking at the exam, what we can also note is, again, the profiles still remain different, and math subdomain shows strongest relative importance with the rest of the cohort of students, while QL subdomain shows strongest relative importance for interest group, followed by mathematics subdomains, in this case, geometric reasoning, algebraic processing, number sense for the interest group of student as compared to the other students. What we see is that in most of the analysis, in most of the engagement that we have illustrated here, the profiles of the students are different, and therefore some different approaches that are needed. We can make certain recommendations based on what we have seen with the data and with the performances. One could approach the intervention in three different phases. For instance, what we've seen that the phase one could be targeting baseline knowledge and analyze the NBTs and NSC performance in relation to test one expectations, or how to, with regards to different textbooks that are used, extra learning materials, etc. Phase one would then support program, phase one support program would then be designed around the understanding of the course concepts and draw on prior mathematical knowledge and experiences based on FET learning. And when designing support program, we suggest using school textbooks, FET curriculum, first year textbooks, as well as looking into the timing of different other courses running in parallel to the course of interest. In phase two, we assume the growing knowledge base, which traces to NBT. We have seen that the NBT is still showing strong relative importance in relation to test two performance. So this phase needs further research into the interest group program load, alignment of various course curricula to analyze the most impactful support for the students. And finally, phase 3 would look at course applications or exam-specific support that may be needed. However, it is possible that many of the currently experienced performance problems will be minimized by phase 1 and phase 2 interventions. And in conclusion, the implication of the analysis illustrated by the scenario here is that the underlying competencies in the subdomains of the diagnostics provided by MBTs need to be put in conversation with the curriculum. Relationships do exist between domains and subdomains. The knowledge in one skill does not exist in isolation of other skills. These relationships then need to be interrogated to determine how the predictors relate to performance in the subject area and what are those implications for teaching and learning. As we know that it doesn't necessarily mean that the subdomain itself, for example, that trigonometric functions and graphs or what you've seen, maybe some other geometric reasoning and so on, they are not necessarily part of the course content, but that they may serve as a proxy for another skill that is important within the context of the subject area of interest. So I will hand over to Sanet for further discussion.
Sanet, you are muted if you're talking.
Apologies, we're struggling to unmute the computer that we use for the presentation itself. So I'm just going to shift slightly over.
Thank you.
So what Tatiana has showed us with the scenario has spoken to this first step, understanding the profile, but it's also touched on in those, specifically in those recommendations, on the reflection on the implications of these diagnostic informations then for teaching. So if we look back, the step 1, we try to get as much information from as many different sources as we possibly can in order to try and understand what the students need, where they are, and how best to support them. Then in step 2, we need to carefully reflect on how this information that we've gathered pertains to our particular content. So we've mentioned the domain mapping exercise before, and this is a very careful analysis of content, whether that is class content or assessments, to look at how the academic demands of that content in terms of the discipline relate to the various domains that we have assessed using our diagnostic instrument. So you try to put the two things in conversation, the diagnostic information that you've received, and then in conversation with the curriculum that you are trying to make changes to. And then the last thing is then to reflect on what the type of decisions are that you need to make. So in addition to thinking about what the possibilities are, for example, in just changing the way you present content, or maybe the way you structure the support materials you provide in class, the changes you make might also be a signal that something needs to change in the curriculum for that particular course. Perhaps it needs to change at a program level. Perhaps it's a signal that some sort of staff training, staff workshopping exercise needs to happen to ensure that everyone working in the cognate subjects are sort of on the same page when it comes to supporting students. In terms of existing student support structures, there might be a need to augment what they do already, or to try and provide this type of detailed information about what the diagnostic information might mean for a particular curriculum, and try and provide them with that type of information so they can better assist students. And finally, those decisions may mean that decisions need to be taken at in terms of policy at an institutional level. So if we try and sum up what we've talked about today, we can say that firstly, we've made the argument that there's a need for change in higher education, and that the use of diagnostic instruments, and by extension, the diagnostic information that they provide, is the best way to facilitate these changes. We've also used the MBTs as an example of such a diagnostic instrument, and we've tried to show you what goes into the design and implementation of an instrument like that. Through the use of our scenario, we've shown you how a diagnostic instrument can be used, and what type of results it can generate, and how you can then try to understand those results, and finally how this fits into what we would propose is an assessment-led approach to curriculum development. Overall, it's clear that diagnostic information can only be put into conversation with the curriculum through careful reflection, and that we need to utilize all the data we have at our disposal to inform our interventions. Thank you from our side. So I think we'll start tackling some of the questions. Can I hand over to you, Robert, for that?
So, thank you, Sanet. So thank you, colleagues, for listening to and participating in the webinar. If you have more questions, then certainly contact any one of us. Our emails are on the PDF that we're going to send to you after this. But let's deal with questions that people would like to ask straight away. We've got some time. We've got some 15 minutes, so we're well in the time slot allocated for the webinar.
Robert, it's Lauren here. If you want to unshare your screen, Sanet, then you will be able to see some of the questions that are posted in the chat. And we have a couple here that you might want to address.
So let's start off with the questions that were put on the chat. I will try and answer some, but certainly my colleagues will take some of these questions as well. The first question was a sort of a curiosity question about how many people completed the survey. Of the 99 people who registered, most of the people actually completed the survey to some extent. There were very few that did not complete it. We will give you that information later in the reporting of this when we feed back to you. But certainly the responses to the survey was very good. And what we tried to capture from it wasn't the whole survey results, but it was a good sample of it. The second question which was raised is how well does the MBT classification account for qualification performances? I think there's 2 points to be answered in this way. The one is, we know that higher education has a GPA, a grade point average very often, And secondly, it has an academic standing measure. And on both those measures, the MBT performs pretty well in predicting the performance on the GPA or on academic standing. I think what we want to do with the diagnostic assessments is we want to turn those predictions around. We want to break those predictions. So in some ways, we want to say we've got information that shows the predictions, but how do we put in place curricula that is actually going to take someone and that may not have a good chance on the face of it, and actually make sure that person actually graduates. And that's the challenge of diagnostic assessment, is to be proactive. Sanet and Tatiana had raised the question of domain mapping, where we use the information from the NBTs, for example. You could use it on any other diagnostic assessment. And you map out what it is that your curriculum, how should your curriculum be responding to the students that you have in front of you. Which one?
I'll take the next one. What informs the MBT academic literacy choice of topics and texts, and how do you cater for diversity and different learner types for fairness? I'll quickly answer this. Thank you, Amanda. That is an important part of what we do. I would say that happens in two phases. The first is in our actual selection of texts before we go into development. We are very careful to try and get texts that do not exclude. So we have a set of very specific specifications for what a text needs to have in order for us to use it for assessment. And then in addition to that, we look at the actual topic that is covered. Currently, our main focus is to try and find topics that either relate specifically to the South African context, or deals with topics that in some way students would be able to relate to, because it is also relevant to either South Africa or the African continent. And finally, we try to include things maybe done by South African authors. So say a project that was launched by South Africans and that sort of thing, to try and keep it relevant to the student population. Then when we actually do our development sessions, there are, as we showed earlier, there are various stages where items go through review. At each of those stages, we do a sensitivity check. That consists of 22 questions that we ask about every single text we do, to ensure that there's nothing that could potentially create bias in the population. And we also check for potential things that could be triggers for students and that sort of thing. So we try and cover it in that way. And lastly, when we do our statistical analyses, we regularly do statistical analyses that look at bias. So we do diff analyses to see that we to try and ensure that our various sections are not discriminating against particular groups. So I think that's that question covered.
Laura Dyson from WITS asked the question, is there space in this approach for students to reflect on the implications of the diagnostic information within causes? And Laura, I think that is a crucial question. In the whole thing, we said right in the end, we said, what are the implications for students? And we can't leave the student voice out. So what the NBTs, for example, is doing is we're doing individual student reports that spells out very clearly the strengths and the weaknesses, how the students are performing on each of the different aspects, the subdomains that Tatiana showed us. It indicates what the strengths and weaknesses of students are in those subdomains. And I think for me, that's an opportunity for a student to say, I take responsibility for my own learning in terms of physics. I know the mathematics, I'm doing poorly on it. I'm not good at quantity, number, and operations. I'm going to work on that as I enter into the higher education sector for physics, for argument's sake. Or for psychology, I need to understand probability. So let me work on probability if that's a weakness. I think we need to do as a sector, we need to do more with students about them taking the responsibility for themselves, particularly as we move in this post-COVID-19 stage.
Okay. The next question is, what is USAF's position on MBT as a diagnostic test that can be used in higher education?
Let me try that question. I think it's difficult to take a USAF position. I think USAF has got very many different challenges. The NBT and its role is only one challenge. The diagnostic information emanating from the NBT, in some ways, is something that we need to co-own as a sector. So I think we need to look at how best do we use the information that's available. We must make sure that we actually impact on the challenges that we face in our institutions. And the challenges are huge. I mean, the reality of that 20-odd% people graduating in minimum time, that's an indictment. We have to do something about it. And I think diagnostic assessments have got a real contribution to make in the sector if we look at it in the right kind of way.
Okay, next question. In your stats across the sector, what percentage of students are at the basic level in relation to the 3 competency areas assessed?
So if I remember correctly, and I may be slightly delayed with this, but it's about in the basic area. Do you want to take it? Precious, do you want to take that one? Okay. While Precious is just looking at the data, because I think that she has the data available.
Yeah,
Okay, so all right, so I'll just take that one. So I'm looking at our national report for 2020 NBT performance. So like my colleague said, we've got 3 domains, AL, QL, and Med. So we've got different percentages for all these 3 domains. So usually for academic literacy, like for last year, which is the 2020 that I'm speaking to, it was like 15.3, that was the basic, 15.3%. And then on the quantitative literacy, it was 45.48. And then maths, 50.96%. So it differs with each domain. Thank you.
maybe you could type those for us in the comment section for anyone who might want to look at those numbers again.
So then let me take the next one from Fricky George. Hi, Fricky. Fricky asks the question, can the MBT diagnostic approach be used to identify students at risk during a course? So the one area that certainly at the University of Cape Town, the science faculty, they've got an attempt to look at the first tests, and they determine the students at risk at the first tests level. So first math test, the first chemistry test, and so on. And if you look at the relationship of the MBTs to those first tests, the relationships are pretty strong. And I would posit that in some cases, and I mean, in not every case, different causes will have different relationships, obviously, but it would be an instrument that could be used to give you an early indicator of students being at risk in a course.
Okay, and then non-course question, to incorporate the students' voice in MBTs, have you thought of including senior students and alumni in item development workshops? That it's not something that's specifically done, but it does happen incidentally. I am, for example,
someone who actually wrote the MBT as a student, and now I'm working on the MBT. So there tends to be a sort of an age range of students. Our participants in our workshop sessions, and we've had a lot of parents
in those workshop sessions before, who are there as experts, and that is our emphasis, but that can also bring in that voice. Our focus is on trying to get participants in those workshops that have experience with working with different types of students, with different types of backgrounds, that can be their representation in those sessions. So we do try and incorporate that, but we haven't actually included senior students yet, but alumni sometimes happens.
Glennie raises the question that I think Riashna asked earlier, and that is the question about if you were to look at a minimalist set of activities to develop a diagnostic test, then I think that's a hard question. You know, for someone who, you know, I suppose I worry a little bit, and the worry I have is that you wouldn't ask a mechanic to cut out the activities that he's going to do to service your car, in the same way that the diagnostic assessment must serve its purpose. If it's going to serve its purpose, then it has to have at least the minimal thing. If you are going to try and reduce the activities, then some of the activities that I would be tempted to reduce would be the pre-trialing of the items. Maybe not do the pre-test and pre-trial. I would do just the one trialing of the items rather than doing all three of it. But I think the main thing would be making sure your purpose is correct. I would say that you would have to at least make sure you've got a good specification table of your tests that you're going to design. So the second one I would argue for as well. Let me just look at the cycle again. Sorry, so I'm arguing for the purpose is clear. I think that's very important. Defining the domain. I mean, if it's going to be a diagnostic assessment for physics or for chemistry, that you would have to be clear about the design and of the domain. Specify it very clearly. I think I'm suggesting that under the development side, you may want to take a little bit less of item development into account, but your expertise, you'd still have to have expertise. You know, people who really know what the tests must do and what the decisions are going to be. I mean, if you're going to put people into special physics classes, you would have to make sure that the test can stand up to scrutiny. You can't put people students into a extra class in physics if you haven't made sure that you've covered all the bases.
Next question would be, what is the difference between the MBTs as a diagnostic tool as demonstrated here and the MBTs to predict success on a course, i.e. does the predictive value of a test tell you how good a diagnostic tool it can be?
Jamia, I think that's a very good question, because it speaks to the point which I made a bit earlier, and that is that under normal circumstances, a diagnostic tool will predict. If on the basis of the diagnostic tool, you take certain actions to break the prediction, you are going to find the prediction is going to be less. So for example, in humanities, if you take the scores on the academic literacy, and then you say certain people need certain attention, they need mentors and so on, and you put those things in place, a student then who might not have performed as well will actually perform above their status, the prediction. And that's what we want. We want this diagnostic information to be used to break the predictions, not to enforce the predictions.
I'd like to add something to that. In essence, for a diagnostic tool, what you want to do is try and in some way see that the diagnosis is the most accurate that it can be. So any sort of evidence of this being experienced in the classroom, when we look at the results, for example, for the MBT, and talking to people with students with these this particular profile in their classroom, saying that they also see these issues in the types of answers they get, in the types of feedback students give them. That sort of strengthens the argument that the diagnosis is fairly accurate. So we want to be able to say that the instrument is saying at that particular point what the student's abilities like, but we're not saying that will necessarily stay that way forever. We're hoping that we can break that. Okay, Jennifer, what do you expect the effect will be on your MBT results for this the class of 2020? Sorry, I think the rest of the question might have dropped off. Will the university sector, Jennifer, maybe you just need to add the rest of the question. We can maybe start answering the first part.
I'll answer the first part, yeah.
I think if I may sort of estimate, I think that the students are going to be less prepared. I mean, if we take the MBT as a measure of preparedness for higher education, then I think the students are going to be less prepared on the NBT's measure, as a measure, than they might have if they didn't have the impact of COVID-19. So that would be my sort of thinking about it. The second part of your question is,
will the university sector have access to your cohort results for this group?
Certainly, we certainly are making available the results, the online testing that we've been doing, but the testing hasn't been as large as we might have expected. And that's going to be dependent on what testing happens in the early part of next year before students enter the universities.
Jamia has a follow-up question. What data do we currently have on predictive value of the MBT, and is this readily available?
Jamia, we have got information about predictive values, and we certainly would be happy to provide it to you. If I'll drop you an email and we can follow up that conversation. But I mean, we've ran a workshop before where we did provide some of the predictive value of the MBTs, and we'd be happy to share that with anyone.
Could you make it available to all of us who participated?
Then Stanford asked, do you make cohort results available for each year? Yes, but some cohorts are requested specifically. But the MBT, the national report is done every single year, and then there are also institutional reports that are also done every year. But if you wanted a report for a particular course or program, then that would be on request.
Herman, your question about the NBT, is it better than the NSC relating to qualification success? There was a study done, and the NBT was slightly better than the NSC, but neither of them were. I mean, one must just bear in mind the whole sector has various activities that they do. They've got extended programs and so on. So the NBT was slightly better than NEC on that predictive study. But you know, it depends on institution by institution, and it depends on program by program. So if you look at the medicine programs, it was highly predictive, the NBT over the NSC. But if you looked at engineering and so on, those were different. And I can't remember the details now. We're just about an hour and a half. We started a bit late. So do we want to, does anyone want to have the last question or last few questions? I think your question, Ephraim, about what challenges do you face in using the NBT in preparing for effective student support? I think the academics and the administrators are very busy people, and for them to take on the question of changing their practices is not an insignificant task. And if they are going to use diagnostic information to inform their teaching and learning and their curricula, it takes a mind shift. I must be honest with you, I've been sort of associated closely with some colleagues in the mathematics department at UCT here, just to mention it. And I mean, you know, they are working very hard to come up with very constructive and valuable changes to their curricula. It's not insignificant. I mean, Tatiana showed the particular case, the scenario, where you actually may have to break a class into 2 different classes if the numbers are appropriate. And this, one of the maths courses, that's what they did. You know, they actually created a specific course for a specific group of students, because you need to address the students' needs, real needs, not perceived needs. Can I please appeal to you to complete the survey that was sent out by Kath? We will provide you with a summary of the survey, and I think it's just very useful to get feedback from you about the webinar itself. It informs us, but it also informs what we provide in future. So thank you once again from me and the team. And again, I want to just, acknowledge the appreciation I have for the various people that participated, and particularly the people from my own team, Sanet Steyn, Tatiana Sango, Precious Mudavanhu, and the colleagues from the Center for Innovation in Learning and Teaching, Catherine Fortune and Lauren Butler, and from Saidi, Fatima Riaman, and Alan Emery, and Jenny Glennie. And then from people like Riashna Staldin and Amanda Petra Barrett from UCT. Please, I mean, you know, a huge thank you to you for making this happen. So thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for participating, and thank you for the questions and for making this webinar a possibility.